Okay, so last time we began with an introduction to the dream of Scipio, right? And we saw that the basic structure of the book has three overlapping stories, right? The one set during the time of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. What character is that? What's his name? Manlius, right? The one set during the Middle Ages, and later on the Black Death. Olivier, and then the one, the 20th century, please turn off your phone, is Julian, right? Okay, so those three characters, their stories, they jump back and forth between those three stories, and of course, our job is to compare and contrast the different choices that those characters make. Sometimes they make very different choices, sometimes they have to face those with very similar kinds of problems. Right, so we went over some of the emerging themes that we saw in our reading from last time. And of course, today we'll expand that. And remember, I said to you, since some of you hadn't had a chance to read those, the opening section last time, we're going to, in our discussion today, cover all of our reading of this book so far in our discussion. Right, so pages 1 through to 35. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about a couple of different themes to kick us off. And the first of these is contained in a philosophical notion that has been, well, not just a philosophical, but a cultural practice that's become particularly strongly analyzed over the last few decades. And that is something called the notion of the gift, right? The gift. And this is something that is visible in all human cultures. All human cultures have cultures of giving, right? And of course, there are manners and etiquette and practices that revolve around giving and what it means to give, what it means to receive, and how these things structure power in a society, right? Now, these things work not only at like the big level, like the level of politics or society or employment or those sorts of things, but they also work in the way in which humans interact with each other on a one-to-one personal basis, right? So there are some famous books that have been written on this. First of all, there's a rather long essay, really a short book, called The Gift, right, by the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss. Right? He wrote this early in the 20th century. Right? And what he was looking at was the way, as he was an anthropologist, so he was studying like tribal structures and tribal behavior. And he was very interested in the way that there were certain Native American tribes that would have what was called a potlatch. And the potlatch was like a ceremonial gift that one tribe would give to the other, right? And then what would happen was that the tribe who received the last gift would try to like outdo, like put on an even more spectacular gift for the other tribe. And what he noticed about this was that actually the more you gave, the more powerful you were perceived to be as a tribe. So this is almost like instead of like declaring war on each other, these tribes would use this gift-giving system to say, well, I give a bigger gift than you, I'm stronger than you, right? And so he started to analyze the way in which gift-giving in human societies represents something that has to do with power in a very strange, very, at first can seem a contradictory sort of way, right? So later, famous things like Jacques Derrida, very famous, relatively contemporary philosopher. You can see here he has written his own book on this, reflecting on Mauss and other thinkers. And this is an idea that has become very prevalent in a lot of thought. So I want you to think about this a little bit in terms of like our own behavior, right? So as I said, this is something that at first sounds very abstract, right? Sounds very like sort of like something that philosophers would just talk about and not something that relates to our everyday lives. But let's see how it does. Right? Now, when someone does something for you, so let's say I hold open the door for Jungmin when she's going out. When you do something for someone, right, I don't have to hold the door for you, do I? I'm just being nice. But what is implied? What is expected of you in return? Right, it's part of our system of politeness, of good manners, is that there is the person who has helped you, that you thank them for that, right? Now, it doesn't always have to be thanks. Like, there can be other things that people do for you, and then you reward them in return, don't you? So someone might help you to move house, right? And you say, well, next time you move house, I'll come and help you, right? Or, you can imagine there are many different scenarios. So one of the things that interests these thinkers is the way in which, when you give a gift, right, it's never really just purely a gift. It's never purely just an act of giving something. It's always an implied exchange, right? It's always implied that you give something back, right? That you owe something to the person that has given the gift to you. Right? Now, of course, the bigger the gift, the more power that is implied that you have over someone. Right? So, if I hold the door for Jungmin and she doesn't say thank you, I won't be like, oh, that Jungmin, I can't stand her. She never says thank you, right? I mean, it's just a small thing. I don't really care, right? But if you do something big for someone and they don't recognize it, they don't say thank you, they don't pay you back in any sort of way, you do feel, right? You do feel like you are not valued. You do feel like you haven't been given your just reward for giving that gift to them. Right? So you can imagine, like if you help someone move house, and they're like, yeah, you can go away now, right? You moved all the stuff, go away. You'd be like, whoa, wait a minute. You should at least say thank you. Maybe even buy me dinner, right? It's one of the conventions of helping someone move, right? But so the bigger the gift, the more the expectation, right, that the other person owes you something. Right? Now, this then leads to some very interesting strategies. Right? Because if you realize that giving a gift to someone puts you into their power, right? This can then lead you in turn to use the gift to gain power over other people. Right? So on the surface, it looks like you are, when you give a gift, it looks like you are losing something, right? I've given away money, or I've given away time, or I've given away energy, right? It looks like you have lost something. But actually, in the process, it can mean that you're actually gaining power by doing those things, right? So let me give you a very everyday kind of example that I see very often. Sometimes I have students come to see me, and what's the convention often when students come to see a professor here in Korea? What do they often do? Bring coffee, or some tea, or fruit juice, or something like that, right? Why? Right? So there's a sense in which you are already saying, the professor actually hasn't given you any time yet, have they? Right? But there's a sense in which you are saying, oh, I'm giving you this, now you owe me some time, right? Okay? So I've been nice to you already, now you should be giving me some time, you should be giving me some attention, right? Now, this, as I said, this is not just something that happens on the big scale. We can see this as something that we all do. It's part of the kind of emotional exchange that happens between human beings, right? Our relationships with everyone, whether it's our friends, whether it's our fellow students, whether it's me as a professor, whoever it is, our lives are lived as modes of exchange, right? And there are certain things that we expect for our efforts, for what we give, and there are also things that we expect, in return for, and that we also expect that we have to do as duties, right, for taking as well. Right? So you can see that even on this very small level, right, there is a logic of exchange that works with regard to the gift. That you can give preemptively, right? Like with the example of bringing coffee to the professor, right? You can give because you want to use that as a strategy of power, right? To say, you owe me this time. Right? Now, of course, you're not being that demanding when you ask me or other professors to do this. Right? You're not saying, you must see me now. But it is a human understanding of this kind of exchange that this goes on when we do these things. And of course, we do them in many, many different contexts. When someone invites me to their house for dinner, right? I'm expected to bring something in return. I bring some flowers or chocolate or a bottle of wine or whatever it is, something small, right? That is part of the exchange, right? It's part of the way in which we think about these things. So exchange is a very crucial part of the way in which we think about human relationships, right? When we think about like the way in which, whether it's lovers interacting, whether it's like we see Olivier and Cicciani. Cicciani is his boss, the Cardinal Cicciani. Remember those C-E-C-C? It's pronounced as two ch sounds because it's an Italian name, right? So Cardinal Cicciani is his boss and his patron, right? And so Olivier is kind of given a gift of being like his, his protege. He's being taken on board in as his student or his worker, right? So there's a sense in which like Olivier owes Cicciani this allegiance to his patron, right? Okay. Now, of course, we've already said that, remember, going back to the symbolism of the Raphael painting of the Dream of Scipio, we're going to see that these different modes of exchange, these different relationships, are going to come into contact with each other and often clash with each other, right? So we're going to see, well, what you owe to your parents or what you owe to your husband or wife or to your lover or to your friends or to your boss or to your country, right? That those two things, those two relationships, right, those two kinds of exchanges can come into conflict. And that this is one of the central things that Ian Pears will get us to think about in this novel is, like, how do we decide? And sometimes, can we even really make a real decision, right? Sometimes it will seem like choosing between two things that we value so much is like just going to be a lose-lose situation. I don't want to lose this and I don't want to lose this, but I have to make this choice, or at least the characters do in the novel. Right? So this logic of the gift, right, is a very crucial part of understanding the way in which humans relate to each other. That everything that we do tends to be seen as part of an exchange, right? But also notice the way in which the gift can be something used as a method of power that is very subtle, as I said, because when you give a gift, it looks like you are giving up something. You are losing something. You're giving away money or time or energy or whatever it is. But in fact, by the giving of the gift, you are also gaining some kind of power over others. All right. So let's take a look at some specific examples of this in our reading from today. All right. This is from page 28. And this is the example I was just talking about with regard to Cardinal Cicciani, right? The cardinal who is Olivier's boss, and Olivier himself, right? And this is where Ian Pears starts talking about this idea of the gift, right? And he talks about how it structures the way in which the society in which Olivier is living and working. It's a central part of the way in which people relate to each other. So here he says on page 28, ever since men began to study themselves, the gift has attracted the fascinated attention of those who see the practice as one of the strangest and most complex forms of communication, particularly but not solely human. When to give, how to give, what to give, these are complex matters, and getting the practice right requires subtlety and care if it is not to miss the mark. In many ways, Olivier, though still so young, had the easiest task, as he lived in an age when the language of gift-giving was understood with a straightforward grammar and simple syntax. So for Olivier, it's easy, right? His position in relation to Chuchani was perfectly clear to both, and there was no possibility of confusion. He did not need to ask for anything in return, as it was taken for granted that this was what he wanted, and the request and its fulfillment, should he succeed, would be to the honor of the donor, rather than placing a burden on him. The boy did not mind the prospect of being under an obligation, perhaps for the rest of his life, since every man was obliged to someone if he was lucky, and all were obliged to God. Right? So you can see here, first of all, what he's talking about here is that the system that characterizes a lot of the late medieval and Renaissance period is that of what's called patronage, right? So all those famous Renaissance artists, for example, that you know, right? So Raphael, we've already seen one of his paintings. Michelangelo, right? All these famous artists and painters, right? The reason that they were able to do what they did was because they had what were called patrons, right? And these were usually people from rich families who had lots of money and lots of power, and they were like, well, what will I do with my money? Oh, I like this painter, I like this sculptor, I like this architect, right? I will give them money, I will give them, enough to practice their art, and they will in turn dedicate their work to me, or paint pictures of me, or dedicate a book to me, whatever it is. But I will give them the means to do what they want to do. Right? So there's this whole system that is in place that's implied that artists and sculptors and architects and everyone who's involved in creative activities, composers, right? They all have the means to do these things through a system of patronage, right? Through a system where they are given this money by rich and powerful people, and that they are able to do this because of this implied system of exchange. Secondly, this reflects a more broad kind of structure within the society this time, and this society is known as feudalism, right? And remembering that feudalism is also grounded in a system of allegiances, that you owe your privileges to the person who is above you in the system, right? So at the bottom are the peasants, right? The peasants are the lowest. They don't really own anything, right? And so they owe their ability to work the land and earn their food and so on. They owe it to the local lord, right? And then the local lord, well, he gets to run the peasants, but he also owes his allegiance to someone who is higher up, like a higher up lord, right? And then eventually this makes its way all the way back to who? Who's at the top of this chain? The king or the queen, right? So the king or the queen is the one that technically owns all of this, right? And everyone who is lower in the chain owes it, the next person up on the ladder, right? So this whole system is built upon you owe someone allegiance, you owe someone taxes, you owe someone the profits of what you make from what you have essentially borrowed from them, right? And essentially everyone has ultimately borrowed from the king or queen, and then you also notice that within the system also the king or queen claims to have been elected or chosen by God, right? So ultimately the king or queen says, oh, well, I don't own this stuff, God owns land, right? Although obviously the king or queen doesn't pay any taxes to God. So, yes. Okay, so we see this first of all in Olivier's case. He's living in this time that both with feudalism and this system of patronage for artists and so on and scholars is a system that is directly set up, right, to be one of gift giving, of owing everyone else, right, for what you're doing. The second example that we see is with our next character of Julien, right? And Julien is, remember, he is a French academic, right? He's becoming a professor. And we see that in his job, right, even though he doesn't have directly, he's not being paid by people who are powerful within the system, nonetheless, the professor who is his mentor and who is his advisor, right, doesn't have the money, but he has the power, right, and the influence to be a kind of patron to Julien, right? So this is still, of course, very often how academia and being a professor works, right? And business and many other things. Like a lot of it is about who you know, as well as like how skilled you are. So the triumph was on the same scale as Julien's achievement at passing the agrégation, right, which is like the passing his doctorate in France. They have a particularly insanely rigorous system where to get a PhD or to become a professor, you don't just write one dissertation, PhD dissertation, you have to write two, right? And this is the agrégation that's mentioned here, right? So you have to basically write two PhD dissertations. That's why some of these like famous professors, they don't finish their PhDs until they're like in their 40s, because it takes that long to write, to write books like that. Okay, although the Frenchman would never have seen the parallels. Rather, he saw his success as the legitimate result of a meritocratic examination rather than the exercise of a fickle personal favoritism, right? So the difference that Julien sees between himself and Olivier is that, Cicciani, he can basically pick favorites, can't he, right? He can just decide, oh, I like this guy. I'll make him I'll give him money or I'll give him a position. Where Julien, he argues that like he has proven his worth, right? He's proven that he is smart and that he is hardworking and therefore he deserves this position. That's where he sees it as different. The element of patronage, the fact that he was under the protection of the great Gustave Bloch, so this is his advisor, his supervisor, who had decided to advance him and by doing so would augment his already prodigious reputation and power, never occurred to him. Right? So Julien, he's fitting into this academic system where he has this sort of, his supervisor, this professor is his patron, but he doesn't really recognize, like he doesn't think about it like consciously. Nor when he left the ship at the end of his cruise and gave Julia Bronson an old book he had found. So here we see a second example of a gift. Gave Julia Bronson an old book he had found at a good price in a Palermo bookshop. Inscribed with an oblique salutation in his own hand, he never for a moment considered any great subtlety in the gift, nor considered that he signaled a desire for something in return. A very few words, yet so many meanings. Right? So Julien, we see at this stage, he's not terribly aware of the way in which the gift can influence the way in which we think about other people. And yet, he still uses, right? He still uses this mode of exchange. On the one hand, he benefits from his supervisor, his professor, right? Backing him, giving him support, right? Showing that he will eventually have a successful career if he remains true to his supervisor. And secondly, this woman that he obviously likes, Julia Bronson, right? He gives her this gift, right? And he gives it to her. And the choice of his gift shows that A, he thinks that she's really smart. He thinks that she understands him. And also it shows that he's not asking for anything in return, right? He's just giving it to her because he likes her, right? So these things about the gift, they really show us a lot about the way in which humans interact and how they relate to each other. And this is showing us the relationship between Manlius and Sophia. Right? And we see that so far with both with Olivier and Julien, both of their gifts have been relatively successful, right? That they have managed to sort of like create this relation and to sustain it through the gifts and through these exchanges. But in Sophia and Manlius's case, we see Manlius is not successful at all because he misunderstands what kind of gift that Sophia actually wants from him. So we see that he actually gives her two different kinds of gifts. Right? The first one, he says, for in Marseille, he offered her two things. Both were rejected. On the first occasion, he had tried to express his esteem for her by giving her money, enough for her to live in security. He had presented her with a small casket filled with gold, a vulgar, ostentatious gift full of the coarseness of youth and the arrogance of his position, which he had not yet learned to control. Right? So he comes across this woman, turns out to be this great teacher, right? And she so impresses him that he's like, oh, wow, let me give you this money. I can make you live comfortably forever. You won't have to worry about money anymore. And she's like, yeah, no, that's not what I'm after. No, thank you. Right? So you can see he misunderstands his relationship with Sophia this first time. And then she asks him, why did you give this to me? She had asked calmly. He replied that it was because she was the only good and noble person in the world. Then let me remain so, she said, handing it back. So she gives back the gift. Right? Because remember what we said, what does giving a gift, even though it looks like giving up something, what does it do in relation to the other person? It gives them power, right? And so what Sophia realizes about Manlius's gift of this gold, right, is that it will put her in his debt, that he will have a kind of power over her if she accepts this gift, right? And will that change their relationship? Yeah, it will, won't it? Because as soon as you have that kind of imbalance of power, then it becomes much more difficult to have the kind of honest, direct kind of conversations that we see happen between Manlius and Sophia, right? So honesty in this case depends upon her rejecting this gift and refusing to allow Manlius have that kind of power over her. Then we see his second gift. On the second occasion, he offered his entire soul and declared his love for her. Right? Again, a crude gesture promptly rebutted, for it meant he had failed to learn anything from her at all. So she turned it into a lesson, starting again the long and arduous process of teaching him something so utterly hidden from his sight. Right? And so this, of course, is where she says to him, look, what you really want is not me, right? And then she takes him into her room and she shows him her toilet, and she's like, well, do you love this part of me? All right, well, that's part of me. You don't love that. So she takes him through this process of showing him why she can't accept his gift. She can't accept his money, and she can't accept his love. Right? And so she has these lessons that throughout she is teaching him. Right? This name, Sophia, what does it mean? Close, but not quite knowledge. It's part of some words, so think of the English word philosophy. Philos means what? Anyone know? It means love, right? So love of what? Love of wisdom, right? So literally that word philosophy means Philos, love, Sophia of wisdom. All right? So Sophia here, her name means wisdom, and in a lot of medieval texts, right, they would write what are known as allegories. Right? And an allegory is, in this case, is where you have someone who actually embodies like a virtue or a quality, right? So they might embody, like in this case, like Sophia, she's meant to be a real character in this case, but you come across, like, for example, there's an influence upon Pears's novel is a philosopher by the name of Boethius. Right? And Boethius's most famous book is a book called The Consolations of Philosophy. And in it, Boethius was put in prison and eventually put to death. But in this book is written while he's in prison, and he has a series of dialogues with a woman who goes by the name of Philosophy, right? Now, is she a real woman? No, she's meant to embody this idea of philosophy, right? But she's presented to us as being a real woman. And there were dialogues, there were plays written in this way, so you could have, a play in which, like, anger and envy and love and hate, like, are all characters that interact with each other, right? So Pears is sort of playing with this idea a little bit, right? Sophia is both a real character and also she is meant to be a kind of allegorical character as well. Okay? We'll also see at the end of today's lecture that she's based upon a real historical figure too. Okay, so that's our first idea, this idea of the gift. And as I said, as we go along, I want you to think about this idea as being a very crucial, very insightful part of the way in which humans interact with each other, right? We can see it not only in the novel, not only in like an abstract philosophical way, but even when we look at our own behavior, right? The way in which we interact with our parents, with our friends, with our lovers, etc., that we can see that there is a logic of exchange of the gift that informs the way in which we interact with each other, right? Sometimes it's based upon money, right? So if you're out drinking, it's like, who pays for the next drink? Or it can be based upon emotions, right? Oh, this friend he's kind of closed and cold to me, doesn't give me the emotional support that I need, right? So we're not really friends. Or this friend is very supportive, gives me lots of, right? All those sorts of things. Okay, so secondly, and this is something, again, that will be a big thing throughout the novel, is this question of whether we lead a public life or whether we lead a private life, and how those two things, well, how important is the intersection between those two things, and can they often, well, they will often come into contention throughout the novel. So we see that when we first meet Manlius, right, early on in the novel, he is he's kind of disillusioned. He's unhappy with the state of the society that he sees around him. Remember, he has some close friends who are smart and learned and well-read like him, but increasingly he sees men around him that he doesn't like. He doesn't like the direction of society. It's becoming more vulgar, right? He doesn't like the direction in which things like religion are going, right? He's worried that they're becoming like barbarians instead of being like the Romans or the Roman civilization that they are. So we see that early on in this quote that he is withdrawn from public life, right? That basically, even though he has power, even though he has money, even though he has this position as a leader, he is basically just staying home and studying and writing poetry and doing what he likes. So it says here, for many years, he stuck to his determination to turn his back forever on public life and live quietly on his estates. He was, after all, one of the richest and most powerful men in the province, even when he did nothing but write poetry. right? So he has all this power, but particularly because of the example of his father, what happened to Manlius's father? Is he still alive? He's not alive. What happened to him? Yes, he was killed, and he was killed because he tried to prop up he tried to help the Roman regime, right? And he died in that cause, right? So Manlius, especially after seeing his father's failure, is like, well, I'm not going to make the same mistake, right? I'm not going to fail like my father did, right? And fight in a losing cause. So his first strategy is to just stay home, do his own thing, study, right? Live his own life quietly, write poetry, and not do anything. But as we see, it's his conversations with Sophia that change his mind about this, right? And she makes several arguments about this. All right, so she gives him one example. She says, an example, she said, you may comment on it when I am finished. According to Aristotle, one of the earliest laws of Solon, and Solon was the great lawgiver of Athens, right? So he was one of the guys who wrote the guy who wrote down like the basis of the Athenian laws. So Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens, said that if a society split into strife and civil war, anyone who refused to take sides should be exiled and outlawed when order was restored. Your opinion, right? And so you see that Manlius and Sophia debate this strategy of Solon's back and forth, right? At first, Manlius says, "Oh, this is a bad idea. It's just going to make more an escalation of the conflict." But then Sophia also says to him, "Well, actually, in practice, though, it meant that people were less likely to engage in civil war because it meant that everyone felt like they had a stake, right? They felt like they had some sort of place in this political system, and therefore they tried to make sure that civil wars didn't happen, right? So she shows him that there are certain ways in which like being involved in politics, being involved in the society, being involved in things is a way of making sure that everyone has a stake in them and everyone feels like connected with that society, and therefore everyone wants to keep that society working well. Right? Disengaging, removing yourself from society creates more disorder, as far as she's concerned. And then she urges him, this is the long quote, it's on page 21 to 22 in our book. She says, you give delicate dinner parties and entertain your friends and write letters and verse which get cleverer by the day. But what when there is no one left to read these letters? No friends to invite, no food to put on the table, what then? The schools of Marseille are long gone. Right. No teachers, no pupils. The schools of Bordeaux even are growing feeble. Do children care anything for philosophy, for letters, for thought? Will their children even be able to read? Right? Remembering that I mentioned to you in the last class that this setting of this story is about 50 years before the closing of Plato's Academy. Right? So if you can imagine, like, if all of our universities today were to close, right, how terrible that would be, right, for learning and for education, right? And that moment when Plato's Academy, which had been open for about 1,000 years, was closed, was a similar kind of disaster for the ancient world, right? Sort of symbolized that like learning was not valued anymore. So, and then Manlius replies, and you think joining the church will help, he asked, scarcely keeping the amused incredulity out of his voice. So he's like, joining the church? How is that going to help, right? How is that going to help with changing this? And then she says, of course not. She said scornfully, I think running the church will help, right? Not joining the church, but running the church. Perhaps even that will accomplish nothing, but at least learning will die with a friend by its bedside rather than abandoned in a ditch. Right? Virtue comes through contemplation of the divine, right? And this is her Neoplatonic side talking, right? Remember we saw that the Neoplatonists, right? Their idea is we're part of the multiple, but we've got to contemplate the one that is beyond, like experience, beyond this world. Right? The oneness beyond this world, that's the divine and the exercise of philosophy. But it also comes through public service. The one is incomplete without the other. And this is where she comes up with a very interesting slogan for us to think about through the rest of, particularly of Manlius' story. Right? So remember this part. Power without wisdom is tyranny. Right? So if you have lots of power, but you're not very smart about it, then you're going to be a tyrant. You're going to be evil, you're going to be mean, you're going to use that power unwisely and unfairly. Right? So power without wisdom is tyranny. Wisdom without power is pointless. Right? So if you know what to do, if you're smart enough to work out how to run the society and what you need to do to make peace and all these other things, but you don't have any power to actually do it, well, you also don't achieve anything, do you? Right? You don't actually, all that wisdom you have doesn't actually do anything, doesn't actually achieve anything. So as we go on and we see the kinds of choices that Manlius makes, think back to these words, right, of Sophia's. Because these conversations that they have early on are quite important to the way in which he then goes on and behaves later in the novel. Okay. All right, now, finally, before we move to our homework sheets, I just wanted to mention a character or a historical figure who is mentioned a few times in our reading for today is a woman by the name of Hypatia. Real-life figure. Right? You see there, we're not quite certain when she was born, somewhere around 350 to 370, right? CE, remember, which is the new term for AD. Right? So around 350 to 370 CE, and she died in 415 CE, and she was killed by a mob of Christians who were angry with her for teaching these Neoplatonic ideas. Right? And remember, Sophia says, well, they were angry because they couldn't beat her in an argument, and so they just killed her. Right? That was the only way they could defeat her. Now, the character of Sophia, we've already said that Olivier's character is obviously modeled by Ian Pears upon that of the Italian poet Petrarch. Right? Similarly here, the character of Sophia is modeled upon this character or this historical figure of Hypatia of Alexandria, right? That there are various ways in which they are very similar. They're both Neoplatonic philosophers, right? They have very similar kinds of teachings, right? And even some of the anecdotes that we have about Hypatia are reflected in the way in which Sophia behaves. So, for instance, the episode in today's reading where Manlius tells Sophia, "I'm in love with you," and she takes him to her toilet and shows him, well, this is part of me. Like this is my body as well. Do you like that? Do you love that? And he's like, no, that's disgusting. Well, there's a similar episode with Hypatia where instead of showing her the guy who declares his love for her, instead of that, she shows him her menstrual rags and I bleed. Do you like this? Right? Do you like my period? And she says, and he's like, so there's very similar kinds of anecdotes that Ian Pears borrows from real history, right? And there are actual real figures from history that pop up in the story. Later on, we'll see the Pope Clement, the Bishop Faustus, and so on. These are real historical figures that make small appearances in the text. All right, so we are out of time. Thank you, guys. Please hand in your prep sheets as you go, and enjoy your weekend. I'll see you on Monday.